Okay. So as I just said, I'm Adam Strom. I'm the Executive Director of Reimagining Migration. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We're going to be talking a little bit about how people have adapted the Moving Stories project that Reimagining has worked with. Carola Suarez Orozco, a few years ago, came up with this really wonderful idea, actually, where she was looking for ways to share stories to help young people put their stories in a larger context. Immigrant origin kids put their stories in a larger context and then put them in a conversation with other people. And actually, the first thing that we did is we created an app. And so we had an app for Moving Stories. And while the app was getting developed, we had a really exciting opportunity to do a workshop for the Boston Public Schools. And so I went, oh no, the app's not ready. The app's not ready. And so what we ended up doing is adapting the project. And since that time, for face-to-face. And so since that time, Moving Stories has become kind of one of the projects that Reimagining is leaned on again and again and again. And so I'm going to put it in a little bit of context. And as I said, then I'm going to get out of the way. So Reimagining Migration's work, at least our content work, is built around our learning arc, right? So at the learning arc, it's kind of, you think of it as a journey that you're hoping to build through the curriculum. And so the first part of the learning arc is Moving Stories. And then in the Moving Stories, which we're going to model through an activity, excuse me, we're not going to model, we're going to talk about it as an activity, but it's also the first part of this work where we really try to think about the role that migration plays in the world around us and how that starts to become visible through stories of migration, ours and those around us. And the second part of that learning arc is looking at understanding migration. And again, that's a chance to do some inquiry work. And then the third part of it is when we turn to action and we start to think about, as we develop some understanding, how do we start to think about ways that we can be bridge builders and to create kind of a more sustainable, cohesive community. All right, so I'm going to be quiet, and but I thought maybe I could just offer some guiding questions that we use for this part of Reimagining Migration's learning arc. So, you know, that this framework, right, is we all have the story of migration, right? Because migration just simply means to move. Migration doesn't have a fancier meaning. I think some of us have images when we think of migration as crossing borders, but that's actually a very particular kind of migration. But migration simply means to move. So therefore, all of us have a migration story. It may not be the same, but all of us have a story. And so we want to think about what's my story, what's your story, and in what ways do stories of migration help us understand who we are? And excuse me, well, I hit that by accident. And then what can we learn from those visible and invisible stories of migration around us? And then as educators, how can we approach the sharing of stories of migration with understanding and compassion that recognizes the uniqueness of other folks' stories, but also gives us an opportunity to do some bridging? So I have an amazing group of panelists, and just so for the sake of time, I'm going to actually ask everybody to introduce themselves, and then each of us are going to go for they, not me, but each of them will go for 10 minutes, and then they're allowed to question each other and stop each other along the way, and then we'll have some opening for questions at the end. But I thought I would start with Joel. So Joel, tell everyone who you are and why you're here this evening.
Well, I'm here because you asked, and I respond to that. No, my name is Joel Troge. I'm from New York City Public Schools, the Division of Multilingual Learners, and my title is the Director of Long-Term ELS, Newcomers, and SIFE, Students with Interrupted or Inconsistent Formal Education. And yes, I'm here for Adam and everyone else, but I'm also here because this is the work of our students, and I'm really excited to share and learn from other panelists as well. So thank you for having us.
So after Joel, turn to Emily.
Hi, everyone. Emily Francis from Concord, North Carolina. I'm a high school ESL teacher This is my 11th year, my 19th in the district, and I'm excited for this invitation to share how I use the Moving Stories unit with my newcomers.
Thanks,
Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks, Emily. And Fernando.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Fernando Lopez. I teach ethnic studies at Social Justice Humanitas Academy in San Fernando. This is my 8th year of teaching. So I've taught US history, world history, government economics, global studies, and now ethnic studies. And I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. And Jess.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Lander. I am a teacher of recent immigrant and refugee students in Lowell, Massachusetts. I teach history and civics, and then I'm also the co-founder of the National We Are America project, which Reimagining Migration is one of our amazing national partners. And so I'm excited to talk about that work and excited to be here with all of you.
Thank you guys so much. I am excited. And what I'm hoping y'all hear in the introductions is that each of the panelists really come from very different teaching experiences, right? Different geographical areas, the student bodies are a little bit different. And I thought that could help us as we start to think about how we might adapt some of this work to our own particular context. So Joel, I turn to you to kick us off.
Thank you. Just give me a second to, may I share my screen, Adam? Is that possible?
Yeah, it is. Of course, I should have given you the right to do that. Hold on for 1 second, because this is not wanting me to do this. Y'all, you're so kind to wait for me. Make co-host. Okay, Joel, here we go. And Emily, I'm gonna do the same.
Okay, so you should see my screen. And let me just make sure I can also put that in the chat. Okay, thank you for allowing me to get that up there. So as I just said, my name is Joel Troge, and I work for the Division of Multilingual Learners in New York City Public Schools. And on behalf of our students and educators, I wanted to say thank you to Adam and Reimagining Migration for all that you do to support us, and also specifically for putting this event together and inviting us to share some of the work that we are doing here in New York City around migration stories and storytelling. But before I get into that, I would like to give also a huge shout out to Abir Shanawi, one of the program director for Reimagining Migration, and an absolutely fabulous collaborator that I've had the chance to work with since the summer of 2021. Abir, who is, I think, currently on a flight to Omaha. I would just highly recommend getting to know her, just a great collaborator. So I really appreciate the focus and the perspective that Reimagining Migration brings to migration narratives, a process that is experienced at the individual level, but critical to our collective story as people in our city, in our nation, and in our world. And I hope you'll see that focus and perspective reflected in the unit that I want to share with you today. And you can see that title there. It's the words we use. And the unit, the words we use for grades 9 and 10 was inspired by feedback that we received from teachers in a previous cohort. And in summary, what they wanted was an instructional unit that did 2 things. 1, featured the Moving Stories interview questions. And 2, was rooted in the instructional standards. And in New York State, that would be the next generation ELA standards. And those 2 points speak to the fact that teachers want to talk about these topics with their students and want to hear and learn from their students' stories, but they also need to make sure that their curriculum fits into the framework of the departments and schools. And that's why the structure of an instructional unit is such an important vehicle for this work, because of its familiarity and function within a teacher's annual calendar and sequence. And so what we wanted to do was to create a unit that was centered on texts, because ultimately it's texts that can help us to connect to the unique and the universal experiences of migration, both from a contemporary and from an historical perspective. And those connections help lead students towards sharing their own migration stories. And in this unit, we used Reimagining Migration's Lowell High School poems. I think I saw somebody from Lowell here earlier, as a type of mentor text for students to use as models to transition their responses from the Moving Stories interview questions to the storytelling craft of poetry, which gives students the artistic license to share the part of their story that they want to share. And one final point before I share it with you, we also wanted to make sure that these texts and everything in the unit are freely accessible and available to teachers nationwide. So this includes one-click PDFs that can be easily displayed or downloaded for student handouts. No additional logins or anything separate you need for that. So we wanted to make this unit as user-friendly as possible so that teachers can focus on the content of the moving stories. And so what I'll do is put that into the chat now. You should be able to access it. If you're not able at the moment, I'll make sure that that is able to be taken care of. But in the interest of our time together, I would encourage you to explore the unit after our session. There's a lot to go through. But for now, I wanted to share a picture and some notes from one of the schools in the pilot that I had the chance to visit last week to help illustrate a few points about the unit. So the class that you see on the screen was an elective for newcomer Ls with developing literacy skills. And so the teacher had made certain decisions to tailor the unit for her students, such as only using section 1 of the focus texts and splitting lesson 6 into 2 periods so that students could have more time to prepare for discussion. And that's what we want teachers to do, to take and to tailor the unit for their students. And lesson 6, by the way, features a video clip and a text from the documentary I Learn America, which you may or may not be familiar with. And so students are quite literally seeing, hearing, and reading about another teenager's experience who might be similar to theirs, but while also creating a space to talk about how that experience is different from their own. So the unique and the universal at play in this one classroom moment. And a final point to make from this snapshot is that this unit makes routine use of collaborative read, talk, write cycles in which students work together to build their language and literacy skills over the course of the unit. And that instructional cycle is actually quite important to the objective of the unit because it gives students the opportunity to practice sharing their stories in lower stakes settings before they are asked to share publicly with the larger group. So finally, for our current cohort of 16 high schools in the unit pilot here in New York City, our next steps are to help teachers transition from the unit level in the classroom to amplifying their students' stories and voices in their school and in their communities. And we actually, as I was talking to Adam before the call, we actually did some of that work earlier this afternoon during our session with some assistance from Abir that I mentioned and Dr. Carrie Carr of Buena Vista High School in Omaha, Nebraska. So it's helping to think about not just these stories living in the classroom. It's not just a classroom experience. It's also a way to amplify, but also create spaces for students to advocate for themselves and their communities. And those schools and community-based projects will be celebrated, and students will share their poems and reflections at our culminating presentation in March. And we're very excited to bring everyone together for that event. And in regards to this unit and this series, I am already looking forward to designing a 2.0 version of this unit based on feedback from teachers and students. I think I got more information from that 45 minutes I was in the classroom last week than I had in 4 months. So literally hearing from students about what was working and what wasn't. And you'll have a chance to sign up to receive that revised draft here in a minute. We would also like to create alternate versions of the unit to be more responsive to the different populations that might use the unit. For example, by substituting a more accessible grade level text for the newcomers, for like a newcomers class that you just saw in the previous slide. While still leading them towards the same outcomes of sharing and learning from migration stories. And of course, expanding the movie stories units to other grades is on our to-do list, not just to live in the 9th and the 10th grade. We chose the 9th and the 10th grade really based on the numbers that are probably reflected in your district, but in New York City, there is just a large spike of new arrivals that enter the system at 9th grade. So it kind of made sense to start our work there. But I'm very excited, maybe especially to go to some elementary grades with some work over the summer. And then connect students across the nation. Since we're dreaming big here, Abir and I have already started talking about how these units can be used to help connect students across the nation, from NYC to Omaha to Santa Cruz, and empower them to help us truly reimagine migration in their own words. So if you would like to receive the second draft of this unit, or even be a part of maybe some of the piloting work, some of the writing work, even just some thought process, I put a link in the chat here. There's also a QR code that you can use. If you're seeing this on a recording, you could pause and look at it and use that as well. So thank you so much for your attention and your time. I'm also excited to be a participant of this webinar and hear what some of our other colleagues across the nation are up to. So I'm going to pause now and pass the baton. But if you want to ask a question, Adam or anyone else, I'm open to doing that, or I can wait until the end. But thank you for your time.
I did the same thing that I've been doing for 2.5 years and muted myself when I meant to speak. I'm sure I'm the only one who's ever done that. So let's hold on and we'll pick up the question at the end. But Joel, I mean, the work that Joel has done, I think is so incredibly impressive, because I think so often we think about how can the district office be really supportive? And I think you've been just an unbelievable model responding to teachers' needs. And what a gift to all of us that Joel's now offering that unit. So thank you so much, Joel. So Miss Emily, I turn to you.
All right, my turn. All right. Again, thank you so much for this opportunity. I always love coming on and sharing what is happening in the classroom, especially if I give you something that you could just take and start tomorrow. And I say tomorrow because second semester is starting probably all across the state, the country. And so I'm already getting ready for second semester. So hopefully you get some lesson ideas here that I was able to steal from Reimagining Migration. So of course, I love, I downloaded the Moving Stories unit, and I don't use every single thing that it is offered, but I think it's fantastic. But I do like to pick and choose what fits my students. I serve students who are at the beginning stages of learning English as a second language. So I need to be very particular, what is it that we are studying in the classroom. So of course, I begin telling my students that we are going to begin a Moving Stories unit, and we're going to end up telling our stories. But I do want to emphasize that in order for us to bring our students a unit on moving stories and telling stories, there's some work that we need to do ourselves as teachers. We need to make sure that as teachers, we do some self-reflection. Do we really embrace diversity? What is our own awareness when it comes to cultures and literacies across the world? There's a lot of reading that we can do prior to bringing these lessons to our students. So personally, if you look right behind me, I love reading. I think reading opens doors and windows to cultures and practices that we're not aware of. And so reading is a great way to get to know other cultures and also observe. If you have people around you, chances are that you have people around you with diverse backgrounds. So observe their behaviors, the way they communicate. Questions. It's okay to ask those around you who have a different culture than yours to ask questions. It's better to ask questions than to assume. So we'll go ahead and ask questions, whether it's to students, to coworkers. Ask so you can enlighten yourself. And of course, begin to build where students feel comfortable. So when you tell them to share their stories, there's already a place that they feel safe, that they know that whatever they're about to share is going to be respected and honored. Okay, so that will be the first thing I do want to emphasize before I start sharing the story. So I do begin by telling my students that I share my own story, and I have some boundaries. I have norms. I wrote my own book. I show my students how to do a short version of my story. And I do tell them that there are some things that I personally hold back because I don't feel like the world needs to know. And so if I do that personally, why not have that responsibility shared onto my students? So we create norms. And these are kind of the questions that I take from the Moving Stories unit from Reimagining Migration, that we are going to build these norms. We are going to maintain a self environment where we're going to respect each other. We are going to share what I want to share, not what I'm forced to share. I can opt out anytime that I want to. So if I'm done, if I don't want to share any more about my story, then I can opt out. And you can go through all of these bullet points, and students will sign their name around the norms, and we'll make sure that we stand by those norms. So of course, these are all newcomers. They have translations of this so they can fully understand what they're getting into as we begin our storytelling unit. And of course, I begin with a whole group instruction. So we have lessons that we do as a whole group. And I do have a whole list of books that I use. I love using picture books. I do begin doing a sketching about ourselves and talking what is it that people can see, people cannot see. I use Show Way by Jacqueline Woodson just because I do believe that my identity, it's tied on and it has a lot to do with my heritage. And so I do think that this book highlights what our ancestors have laid out for us. We read stories that show persistence, like Emmanuel's Dream. We read Henry's Freedom Box. And we go beyond just by reading picture books. We make sure that students know how to read it, how to write it, how to make sentences, how to do projects. So here you can see a fun, interactive way that students took Emmanuel's story compared to their own. What is it that we can see and what is it that we cannot see? I really think it's important for us to begin reading stories about persistence, about different backgrounds, about what others are doing around the world before we start talking about our own story. After reading each of these stories, I do these reflection questions, and these you can also find in the Moving Stories unit. Why might this story matter to me? So after reading Emmanuel's Dream, why is this story important to me? Or why is this story important to the people around me? Or why is it that I should share that or Twitter out to the world? Why is that important? So after we read each one of those stories, we reflect on these questions. Each student is given a sticky note, and we reflect if the story is important to them, why? And should we take that story and share that with someone else? I have a slide here. If you go into this link, this is where my students, if you don't want to use sticky notes, I created a presentation where they can go in for each book that we read. They can answer all those 3 questions. So it's up to you which one is your preference, whether it's sticky notes or just have all their answers in one place. That will be totally up to you. You're welcome to make a copy of that presentation. So after we move into this whole group presentation, we take a little break into recipes. I do believe that food is so important in our cultures. Oh my goodness, like seriously, for me, there's no Christmas without tamales. So I do believe that my culture is so tied into our foods. And so in order to bring the best out of our students, we create an ESL recipe book. So I'm also including a link of a presentation that you can just make a copy and create with your students. Your students give you the ingredients, You make a list of the equipment that you're going to use, and then the process on how to make that food. And what's interesting is that a lot of them may not know how to make this specific food, but they'll go home and they'll ask their mom or their grandma, hey, ¿cómo hago los tacos? ¿Cómo hago los tamales? And then they'll begin having that conversation with family before they come home. So it's such an interesting way to bring family cooking ideas in here. And I know we have our next presenter here sharing a lot about this. I can't wait for her to share that. And then we move into our partner or our independent work. So notice how I do a whole group, and then I deviate into independent, and then we go back working into partners. And this is where we do a lot of picture book work. And if you notice, all of these picture books that I use are all about different experiences, different backgrounds, and all of them, if not most of them, are all by authors, authentic authors. They have experienced all of this walks of lives. So I partner my students, whoever they want to work with, they read the picture book, they do an analysis on that picture book. What is it that this character is experiencing? Why is this story important to me? Why is this story important to those around us? And why is this story, The Last Stop on Market Street, why is it important to the world? So those same questions that we analyzed together at the beginning, now they're going to do it by themselves or with their partner as they analyze a picture book about different walks of life. And then we move into understanding migration. So I do believe that who we are before my students step here to the United States, they bring with them, and what I brought with me my whole entire culture when I came from Guatemala. And so it's important for us to highlight that, to highlight those experiences that we lived before coming here, to understand how is it that I develop here in the United States. And so, of course, we move into understanding those push and those pull factors. Reimagining Migration calls this a motivation for migration. And I love that. You know, I do use that phrase with my students, but we look at the push and pull factors just because that's our standard. And then we understand what is a push, what is a pull. And as we read our stories about migration, then we understand why they had to leave or why they made the decision to come here to the US. So I have links here to different articles. Borderland is a beautiful presentation. There's another article about the Darien Gap that I have never heard of, and I was able to study that with my students. We have graphic novels, I use magazines, I use News ELA, beautiful articles about migration. So we do read about the challenges that these characters are having and the choice that they made to come to the US, and then the change, like what happened once they made it here. And once they go and understand this, we compare and contrast those stories by using the same questions from Reimagining Migration. What's similarity? What's the similar between one story and another? How are they different? Or what are the challenges that one story has with the other story? So we engage on these questions. And then we close our unit with our own story. I really would have loved as a teenager to have the opportunity to share about my own personal experience. And I was never given that chance until I was an adult. And I really think students do want to have that opportunity and that space to share their stories. So I do share again, we go back to look at those norms. Do we want to make our story public or just for the teacher to read it? Do I want to print it out to read it to my peers, or do I just want to keep it to me? So those norms are revised again as we write about our own story. And I do want to emphasize that I don't just tell them, okay, sit down and tell me your story. No, I don't tell them what to write exactly. But I do use Reimagining Migration has a whole list of questions that you ask when you interview someone, right? And those same questions, I use it for students to guide their story retelling, the motivation for migration, the journey, the hopes, the advice that they have for others. So they have topics of what to write about. If you are interested in reading about my students' stories, you can check out this link and you will see what my students are able to tell about themselves. We use Write Reader is a free app for teachers that allows you to create these books, print them out or email them or share on social media. All right, so this is all I have. I do have some resources on books that I use, some links that I use that can give me an idea on what books to use as we develop the unit. More resources to help you out. And please stay connected and let me know if there's anything I can help you as you implement any of these lessons that I just shared with you.
Thanks so much, Emily. Just before we turn to Fernando, there were one person didn't catch the name of the app. What was the name of the app you used?
Write Reader app.
Thank you so
And
much.
I just shared the presentation. So there you go. You have access to everything if you would like to have it.
Thank you so much, Emily. All right,
Thank
Fernando,
you.
take us away.
All right. The way that I'm going to approach this is what happens when you don't necessarily have the resources while you're planning, and then how can you make your lessons better once you have resources like the ones that Reimagining Migration offers. So I'll kind of take you through a little journey as to what I've done. So I used to teach U.S. history, and when I noticed when I was learning U.S. history was that it seemed like we were in a naval academy or some kind of military academy because we were learning about battles and military. I think we spent maybe a month on Operation Barbarossa, and I can still tell you about it, but I'm never gonna go and actually sweep through Russia during the winter and during a war. And so what I tried to do with my US history class when I was teaching 11th grade was teach thematically. If I could teach thematically, then it allowed me to break away from the structures that existed, which was just following the standards and following the book. And so in order for me to integrate more student voice into my curriculum, at least for US history, I always started with Unit 1 with the American belief system, because whether the students are first generation, second generation, newcomers, third generation, the idea is like, what exactly are these beliefs that are maintaining our society? And then from there, I think the conversation really started rolling into like, are these beliefs just a lot of hot air, or are we actually upholding something that we're working towards? I moved on to Unit 2. Unit 2 is Who's an American? I think it's like a very popular way of approaching it, but what I wanted to do was contextualize their lives. I didn't necessarily, I liked history. I didn't necessarily like how removed I was from history when I was learning it. And so in order for my students to actually connect to the history, they were the history that we were studying. And so one of the things that I enjoyed doing in that unit was exploring a lot of the laws that really established this idea of what an American is. And then at the end, really just redefining that with different stories. Because of the variety of students that I had in my classroom, some of them at this point are really far removed from migration, at least immigration from other countries. And so what I did was, and now when I look at the Reimagining like units and everything else, like it would have been super helpful for a young teacher to have at his disposal. Instead, I was just kind of wandering alone in the dark, hoping to grab onto something. I always imagine myself like that little squirrel from Ice Age. I'm just trying to find that little acorn and trying to put things together with them falling apart and destroying the world within my classroom. And so what I was able to kind of put together was something now that when I look at the unit that's available, it's very similar. And so the students will go out and interview someone. They decided a lot of times to do parents. Some of their parents were born here. They didn't have access to second, third generation people. So we would find teachers on campus, and the idea was here to connect the students to people. I think history often is devoid of people's stories. We do a lot of big picture, very little zooming in on the people that are actually being impacted by these policies. So in this unit, at the end of the unit, we put together these stories into an actual video. So instead of looking up a documentary on an event that happened in the United States, their migration story, or the migration story of the person who came to the United States, became contextualized in either US history or the larger history. And I think the best way to learn about what they've learned in my class is to show you what they demonstrated in their learning. So I have a video at this point. This is from 2018. I was just left kind of speechless when I was watching this, and I enjoyed how this student was able to see her mom in the larger stories of the world. And it was no longer, hey, I'm going to my US history class. It's, hey, I'm going to this class to understand how my mom ended up in this country, and then the stories that are attached to that. So I'm not just consuming history, I am part of this history that is being taught here. So I'll be quiet. I always tell my kids, it's better when I'm silent so that you can learn from each other. So I'll show you kind of what she was able to put together.
In the year 1980, a civil war broke out in El Salvador due to the conflict between the
And my paranoia is always there because it's been forever. Can y'all hear? Were you able to hear the video when I started? All right, fantastic. Here we go.
military-led government and the Farabundo Marte National Liberation Front. My job during the war was to bandage up the soldiers and prepare them to go back onto the battlefield. Since I did my services on the rural side of the country, we would need to be on horses, take the boats, helicopters, anything we need to get on to get where our support was most needed. The Civil War took a great toll on the country, causing more gangs to appear. In my opinion, the effects that the gang violence took are far worse than the misery that was originally caused by the war. Although this did play a factor in my decision to immigrate to the United States, the main reason was my daughter. Naomi, my daughter, was born with a heart defect that had to be surgically fixed. If she did not receive the surgery, over time her heart would swell up, ultimately causing her to be unable to walk. Due to the lack of technological advances in El Salvador, the only way Naomi could have a better lifestyle was by immigrating to the United States and receiving the surgery. I told Naomi's father about my plan, and in less than 3 days, the trip was planned out. We were able to fly from El Salvador to Tijuana, where I handed over Naomi to strangers and hoped she would be able to pass the border. Then, my oldest son and I took a bus from Tijuana to Mexicali, where we were brought over by Coyote. Stepping into the United States, the first thing I saw was a little shopping center where I could finally buy water and a snack for me and my son. While my son was sitting next to me, so many thoughts were running through my head. How are we going to pay the bills? Will my family adjust? Where do I even start to look for a job? After a few hours of contemplating all these questions, my cousin picked us up and took us to her home. For the first few months of living in the US, we stayed at my cousin's house, where we would be provided with food and shelter. With the support of my cousin, my family quickly adjusted, and we bought the home we currently live in. Being in the United States has opened many doors for me and my children. My oldest son was able to graduate high school and attend college. My daughter was given a full scholarship to a private high school, and eventually I was able to bring over my oldest daughter with my nephews. Although I never planned on immigrating to the United States when I was younger, it has brought my family and I a great amount of joy, and for now has secured the safety of me and my family, which is something I will never take for granted because it is a privilege many would desire back in El Salvador.
And so for me, it was always interesting meeting parents or guardians and having conversations after these kinds of projects, because for them, it was like the class became an extension at home. And that's what my goal always is, that the learning doesn't stop in the classroom. And so the students were able to go home and then have these conversations with their parents or with grandparents. Sometimes it was uncles, friends, and they were able to see the impact that history has on people. And it wasn't just like, hey, people are coming over for no reason. And that's kind of the immigration situation here in the United States. It's not, that's not the case. There's a lot of reasons why people migrate, and we were able to see the variety of reasons in class. And then the parents were able to express, and the families were able to express kind of their motivation for being here. And I think it paints a better picture of why people migrate, as opposed to the talking pieces that we often hear online. And so with that, I also like action. I don't necessarily like history being stagnant and just stuck in the classroom. So then I would end my units with something called YPAR, or Youth Participatory Action Research. After we kind of learn about the ideas of the US, after we're able to navigate our stories, then it's like, right, let's take some action behind it. And so students are able, or we're able to choose a variety of topics to explore. And because it was at the 11th grade level, some of those topics, you know, were fairly complex, and I had to learn alongside of them, which I always enjoy that experience. But it was all based on stories, like the experiences of my mom or the experiences of someone else. Now, because of those experiences, now because I know about them, I can actually then care about something in the world. And I think oftentimes you hear people dismiss teenagers as people that don't care. They care. You need to be able to help them contextualize what's going on for them to understand why they have to care and how to actually address those things. Now that I teach 9th grade, I focus a lot of my attention on the power of storytelling. So the first unit I cover, or the first 2 units I cover, are all about students. And so for me, there's like an urgency to get your story told. And so I allow them to kind of explore who they are the first semester and what story they feel like they need to say. And so that this quote in front of you is kind of what's been guiding my first semester the last couple of years, which is people have told stories about you, people have told stories about your family, people have told stories about your culture. You get the power to tell the story yourself now. So it's an empowering process of you're in control. It's no longer whoever's publishing the textbooks. It's no longer anyone else. It's, what do you want to share with the world? Is this something that you feel comfortable sharing? And then if so, then let's go through the process of making sense of who we are. And I think that's a very important aspect, especially as a teenager, where the world is telling you a bunch of things. And sometimes you need time to stop and reflect, like, who am I? What created this person that is currently navigating the world? And so that leads me to something that the next presenter can most likely, or will, present on significantly and more in detail, but it's the We Are America project, which I've honestly, for me, partnerships are important. I'm a network, so if the students can benefit from the network, then it's great. So I'll let Ms. Landers talk about that significantly more, but my students this is the 3rd round where they're writing a book. And so I'm just excited that they get to cement a piece of who they are. Oftentimes, these are migration stories. Oftentimes, these are stories about the impact of migration, and they're able to get that off their chest. And like I say, I think at some point they're immortal at this point within the pages of this book. So thank you very much. If you ever need anything, I mean, just to bounce ideas or reach out, those are my emails. Reach out. Put a 2 at the end of my last name, or else you're going to be contacting a plumber somewhere in LAUSD, and he will not redirect your message towards me. So thank you so much for listening. And I'm here to learn, and I've learned so much already from the people before me. So thank you so much.
And I just want to say, this evening is a reminder for me about why I love working with teachers. Y'all are brilliant. I mean it. I'm learning so much with each of you. But the idea is not for me to talk, so I have a lot to say, but I'm going to shut up. and turn this to Jess. So Jess, what was this We Are America thing that he just talked about?
Absolutely. And I'm throwing something in the chat right now, which is a resource guide. I just figured I'd throw that out first. And I can also keep things a little short so we have some time for Q&A. But I will share my screen and briefly talk about what the We Are America project is. And it's just really powerful to be on the call with Fernando because I get to work with him, and we were just in communication earlier today, which is just really, really lovely to be on the call with him. So as I said, my name is Jessica Lander. I'm a teacher at Lowell High School. I teach almost all recent immigrant and refugee students from about 30 different countries. And one class I teach is the class, a seminar on American diversity. And this is the founding class of a project that then became the national project that connected me with Fernando. In that class, we study big history of movement, laws, and cases that have transformed the country. And in 2018, we were starting off the year, and we'd always studied the big history, but we realized that to really deeply understand what it meant to be American, to really study American history, we had to understand and study the individual strands, the individual stories of each of the students in my class and their family's history to better and deepen our understanding of the country's history. And my students were also grappling with questions around belonging. So some of my students, whether they were new to the country in the last, say, year, or their families had been in the country for generations, were struggling with whether some felt they belonged, but didn't know if other people thought they belonged. And others weren't sure if they belonged. And so as we were discussing and beginning this year and this learning together, we decided that who better than to redefine what it meant to be American than the next generation. And so my students set out to write a book. And that takes us to Moving Stories and then how that led into the work we did. In the beginning of the year, we set out to explore ourselves and to share stories of our history, to explore our own history. Some of my students, that meant going back to families to ask questions, but to share and explore these stories first with themselves, then with each other, then whole groups. And then, of course, in the public format, which I'll get to in a moment, the We Are America project. And so the Moving Stories project has been a huge part of our work since the beginning. And I'm just so grateful for Adam and Reimagining Migration and this work, because what I found in watching my students share their stories with each other was just so powerful in the ways that they connected with each other. First, in the ways they talked about how sharing their stories, even in these small conversations at the beginning of the year, was really freeing or really powerful because they hadn't been asked these questions or no one had ever listened to them. For some of my students, it was a little nervous to do that, but they were finding connections between each other's stories, even if their families, again, one family had come last year and the other 300 years ago, they were finding connections in those stories of migration. And it really brought the class together in a really powerful, beautiful way. And honestly, the national project wouldn't have happened without the connections, the collaboration, and the trust that was built, partially through projects like the Moving Stories early on. So from this, these smaller explorations in class, my students set out to choose one story of self and share that publicly in a book that we published, We Are America, in the fall, and then the spring semester published its sequel, We Are America 2. And in it, and these are just a selection of some of the pages, each student chose to share one story of themselves. Some of those stories spanned a lifetime, some of them spanned a couple moments. Some were joyous and some were harder, more challenging stories. And at the end of the semester, my students started sharing it out into the community. They talked on radio and newspapers. They presented at local universities. And at the end of the year, their semester had ended. The second semester was really wrapping up. Many of my students were graduating. They came back to my classroom and said, Ms. Lander, you know, this work has to continue. We can't stop. And they were about to graduate. Classes were done, grades were in. But what we did that afternoon is we mapped out on the whiteboard of my classroom a national project. What would it look like? And then I turned to my students and asked, would you be willing to be a part of that? And they said, absolutely. And so for the last 4 years, we have run the National We Are America project. And that's where I know Fernando from. We sent out an application. I sort of tooled my curriculum. I reached out to Adam and said, would you partner with us as one of our national partners? And teachers started applying from all over the country. And for the last 4 years, my former students, now colleagues, have been mentoring teachers across the country who in turn have been working with their students to tell and to support their students in telling stories of self that they then publish books of and share in their community. And so we have these 3 national partners, and just Reimagining Migration has been such an important partner in this work that we do, really starting with projects like and ways of thinking like the Moving Stories Project. We are collaborating with teachers in more than 25 states. And if your state is not yet represented, please reach out to me. And if your state is represented and you're interested, please reach out to me. And in addition to the books that are created that each teacher gets and students get, so they walk away being a published author, one of my amazing colleagues, former students, who does all the things on websites, she's incredible, and I don't know how she does it, it's magic, has built us a website. And I've shared that in the resource guide I just shared with you. And in it now sits more than 500 stories of young people sharing their identities, their stories, many of them stories of migration. And they're up there for all of us to learn from them. So just briefly, here's just a few of the titles out there across the country. It's just been such powerful opportunity to collaborate with teachers across the country on this, and to see them sharing their books, sharing their stories in the community, presenting at school committees, giving public talks, speaking to reporters, speaking on TV about their work, about their stories, and that communities are really seeing our young people as the teachers they are. And then just sort of a fun part of this too is that shifting of the dynamics of having our young people be mentors and teachers to our adults. And so my colleagues, my former students, are mentors to teachers who are teaching fellows, and then they also zoom in and talk to students as well. And so I hope you'll check out We Are America and listen to some of these really powerful stories, particularly the stories on migration. I also, because Emily mentioned, I'll just throw this out, but I know we're almost out of time, but Emily was talking about cooking, and Emily and I have talked a lot before, and we both really resonate with the importance of recipes and connecting with families, and again, centering families as teachers in our classrooms. And so I also do a cookbook project, which Emily was alluding to earlier, which also centers stories of migration. So my students choose a family story, a favorite family recipe, and then they tell a story about that food. What are maybe the connections to culture or history or tradition? What are their memories of that food? And then a little bit about their migration and their story of coming to this country. And we share that project in our class. We eat the food together, which is delicious. And then they publish a cookbook and become published authors as well. They share those recipes, those stories out into the community so that our community can learn from them. And then a fun partnership is that in the last year, our Lowell Food Services for the district reached out to our class and said, we would love to feature your recipes. And now once a month, the cafeterias across the district serve our families' recipes from our cookbook. And so are serving our students food to 14,000 students. And it's the first time that Cambodian food has been served in our district, or food from Somaliland. And so that's been just a really powerful collaboration of different ways we're exploring moving stories, both in our classroom and also sharing those stories out in our community. So our teachers, our students can be teachers in our community. And so just to give a plug to my students, because I feel that's mostly what I do, is just plugging the amazing things they do. Our newest cookbook just came out in December. If you're interested in it, I put a link in our resource guide, but it literally is hot off the press, and it's filled with about 76 recipes from 21 countries. And they're delicious recipes. I've tried them. And then finally, just briefly, I have explored a lot about these stories in depth, and sitting down with my own students to hear their moving stories, their stories of migration in my new book that just came out in October, Making Americans. So I hope you'll check that out, which weaves together some of these stories of Making America, of We Are America and the Tasting History Project, and really powerful stories of my students and their migrations. I will turn it back over to you, Adam.
Thank you. So time is tight, so I won't try to do a fancy sum up, but what I do want to say is that I think what you get here is a through line of, here's a germ of an idea, right? What Reimagining Migration is offered is some resources, a piece of pedagogy, and I think the excitement and I think the magic of teaching is when people think about who are their students and how do we empower them. And empower is almost the wrong word. How do we kind of get out of their way so they can be successful, right? So my job isn't to hand everybody, here's what you do, but to really see how we can support you to customize that work so it comes alive in ways that are authentic to your own community. So I'm going to be quiet and let's see. I mean, I think we really only have time for one question, but everybody seems to have shared their email. But let's get one question. And if you could do it by taking off your the mute. I guess not, which is okay because time is tight. So what I would say is you have Joel's email, you have Emily's, you have Fernando's, you have Jess's, and just for the sake of wrapping up, and so I can do this in an official sort of way, what I would suggest is some next steps following up from this webinar. Number one is I will send everyone a brief evaluation survey, very brief, 5 questions. I would love it if y'all would consider following us on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, LinkedIn. And what I like, and this is what actually helps us keep going, is if you're doing work related to reimagining migration, tag us. So we can start to see what's going on in the classroom, and then we can help promote your work, right? I mean, this is how we learn from each other. Social media has all kinds of downsides, but one of the great upsides is it can be a connector between educators. So if you're interested also in professional services for your school district or institution, reach out to my colleague Abir, who's Abir at Reimagining Migration. And Joel mentioned her before. Joel, say something about what it's like to work with Abir really quickly.
It's like working with your best friend.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I love to hear that. Thank you so much.
Who also has great ideas.
And the last thing I'll ask is we're a nonprofit organization, and consider, this is a small evening. We don't charge for webinars, but consider making a small donation to support this work. Consider it Adam passing the hat at the end of the evening. So I'm going to send you all, and you can do that by just going to our website and you'll see the donate space there. But I want to thank you all so much for participating this evening. And particularly I want to thank Joel and Emily and Fernando and Jess for really showing us, where these ideas can go. And I thought they were really wonderful, practical ideas for the classroom. I hope you did too. I know that many of you still have questions. That's okay. And you have contacts to go and reach out to. And I'm just going to put it in people's head, just one last one. Sue is writing about critical race theory and how do we think about teaching about these kind of ideas in the context of critical race theory. So I'll leave that as something for us to consider, right? How do we think about the political context, the social context, and keeping our kids safe at the same time? So thank you all so much for being here this evening. I appreciate it. Good night.